The aftermath of victory. In the year 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended a long series of wars with the French that had plagued the British colonials on the eastern seaboard of the continent for 3/4 of a century. Those wars had ended with a total British victory. The French were evicted from the continent. All of North America, from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico, and from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean, was British. West of the Mississippi and to the south, North America was still Spanish. But Spain had been a declining power for over a century, and she caused the British, and the colonists too, little worry. This was especially so, since the Spaniards had been forced to give up Florida, which had been their bastion for nearly 2 centuries, a stronghold from which they had harassed the southern colonies. The great northwestern reaches of the continent remained as yet unclaimed, and still a third power, Russia, sought for furs in what is now Alaska. But that was of no moment to the colonials in the East at that time. And yet, this total victory was the beginning of troubles for Great Britain. The defeat of their enemies began a train of events that led to the greatest defeat Great Britain was to suffer in modern times, and to the birth of a new nation destined in the course of 2 centuries to become the most powerful in history. It is with this tale that this book is to be concerned. The basic trouble was that the British colonists were coming of age, were gaining a self-consciousness which the British and their government were oblivious of and did not recognize. The settled portions of the 13 colonies had an area of about 250,000 square miles, nearly 3 times that of the island of Great Britain. By 1763, there were about 1.25 million settlers of European origin in those colonies, to which might be added the unpaid labor of over 250,000 black slaves. The population of Great Britain at the time was not more than 7 million, so the colonial population was, even then, a respectable fraction of the British. What's more, colonial society had grown to be distinctly different from the British. The colonial population was already quite mixed, and in addition to men of English descent, there were also sizable numbers of people whose ancestral culture was Scotch, Irish, Dutch, German, or Scandinavian. The pressures of the frontier made colonial society far more egalitarian than that of the British, and there was a contempt among many in the colonies for British titles and British subservience. More and more the colonials thought of themselves not as transplanted Englishmen, either through descent or through adoption, but as Americans. It is by that name I will refer to them henceforward. Nor had the recent association of British and Americans as allies in the war against France done the least to endear the two peoples to each other. Familiarity had led to contempt on both sides. The British officers saw the Americans as a rude, uncultured population, undisciplined, untrustworthy, and barbaric, perfectly willing to trade with the enemy for the sake of profits. Since the Americans had no trained professional army and generally fought in a guerrilla fashion suited to the woods rather than to the tamed battlefields of Europe, they were considered cowardly by the British. To the Americans, on the other hand, the British seemed overbearing, snobbish, and tyrannical. Each side felt that it had won the war against the French without much help from the other, and even despite the other's positive hindrance. To the British, the war had been won by the regular army at the climactic Battle of Quebec in 1759. To the Americans, it was won by endless battles against the Indians, endless small skirmishes, and the suffering of a number of massacres of women and children. It was a war in which they had heroically won Louisbourg, only to have the British pusillanimously give it back. It was a war in which the British had been disgracefully defeated at Fort Duquesne, and were saved from complete annihilation only by the Americans. Until 1763, of course, Americans could not freely indulge themselves in complaints against the British. The French were the enemy, and Great Britain's power was needed. But now the French were gone, and the Americans, secure in their land, felt free to stand up against the British at last. This was all the more true in that many Americans foresaw a glittering future. With France gone, all the land as far west as the distant Mississippi was open to American settlement, it seemed to them, and the colonies would continue to grow in area and population till they were a great power on the earth. Who would stop them? But alas, the new lands were not empty. The French might be gone, but the Indians were not. Nor were the Indians pleased with the settlement of 1763. The British were not as ready as the French had been to welcome the Indians into the forts on an equal basis, but had made their European sense of superiority distressingly obvious. They did not see fit to soothe Indian self-respect with fair words and presents, but somehow expected the Indians to recognize their own inferiority and to know their place. What's more, the British were not interested primarily in furs. There were settlers on the coast who wanted land, who wanted to push the Indians aside and convert the wilderness into farms. And the French, as they made ready to depart, whispered all this into Indian ears and did not scruple to encourage them to resist, holding out vague promises of future help. An Indian leader named Pontiac, who had been born in what is now northwestern Ohio and who had fought with the French, came to the fore. He formed a confederacy of the Indian tribes between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, and arranged for surprise attacks on various western outposts in May 1763. Barely 3 months after the Treaty of Paris had been signed, and peace had, apparently, come. The plan showed initial successes. 8 forts in the Great Lakes region were taken, and their garrisons massacred. Detroit, however, held out against an attack led by Pontiac himself. Fort Pitt, at the site of modern Pittsburgh, withstood an Indian siege, and to its relief, there marched a company of 500 British regulars under Colonel Henry Bouquet. On August 2, 1763, the British encountered an Indian force at Bushy Run, 25 miles east of Fort Pitt. Bouquet defeated the Indians in a 2-day fight, and though the British lost heavily too, that was the turning point. Fort Pitt was relieved on August 10th, and Pontiac was forced to lift the siege of Detroit in November. Little by little, Pontiac's coalition broke down. The tribes deserted him, and Pontiac himself was forced to accept peace on July 24, 1766. He kept the peace with the British thereafter, but was killed in Cahokia, Illinois in 1769 by an Indian of a tribe at enmity with his own, and one who may have been bribed for the purpose by an English trader. It was a compromise peace, however. The British had no desire to commit themselves to endless wars against the Indians and to a constant effusion of blood and money in a wilderness 3,000 miles from home. Nor were they particularly willing to see the irritating colonies grow without limit. They therefore agreed on their part to safeguard the Indian hunting grounds west of the Appalachians. On October 7, 1763, a royal proclamation established a western boundary along the ridges of the Appalachians, beyond which settlements might not be made. It was this, more than anything else, that broke up Pontiac's coalition and brought peace. To the Americans, however, the proclamation line was an abomination. It had the effect of confining them to the coastal plain, exactly where they had been confined before 1763 by the French. Where, then, the Americans thought, was the point of defeating the French? Restlessly, the Americans pressed against the proclamation line and learned to ignore and therefore despise laws made in Great Britain. The Western settlers, the land speculators, the fur trappers, all learned to think of the British government as an enemy siding with the Indians. In Virginia, the oldest and most populous of the colonies, the land hunger of the great plantation owners was particularly marked. It had been their desire to colonize the Ohio Valley that had been the immediate cause of the last war with the French, and many of them, despite their ties to English culture, became increasingly anti-British. The most prosperous and influential Americans, however, were the merchants of the coastal cities, and of New England particularly, men who had built fortunes on sea trade with the West Indies and with Europe. If Great Britain had managed to keep their loyalty, disaffection might have been held within bounds. The more conservative Americans might themselves have kept the ill-organized farmers and frontiersmen in line. The failure to do this was Great Britain's greatest tactical mistake. For 100 years, Great Britain had been attempting to regulate American trade in such a way that British manufacturers and landholders might profit by it. By the standards of that time, this seemed rational to the British. It had been British initiative which had seized and colonized the territory on which the Americans lived. It had been the British Navy and the force of British arms that had continually protected them, first against the Dutch and Spanish, and then against the French. Since the Americans existed and thrived by the bounty of Great Britain, why should they not make some return for that? It was almost as though Great Britain viewed the Americans as having rented their vast territory from the mother country, and expected them to pay rent gladly. To the Americans, of course, it looked quite different. The colonies had been settled by men who had done the work with very little help from the British government, and in some cases because they had been driven from their homes by religious persecution. It also appeared to the Americans that they had defended their homes against Indians, Dutch, Spanish, and French without much help from the mother country. It was only in the last war that Great Britain, her own interests threatened in Europe and Asia, had decided to take a vigorous part, and even then the Americans had helped tremendously. Therefore, when the British attempted to control American industry and American trade in such a way as to channel money into the pockets of British merchants and landowners, Americans felt this to be unjust. American merchants responded by carrying on illegal trade with other countries, or by carrying on trade without paying customs duties, or in other ways cheating Great Britain of the money she was trying to collect. Americans considered themselves not to be breaking the law so much as to be disregarding unrighteous and tyrannical restrictions. It was over the matter of trade restriction and smuggling that the commercial interests of New England and the seaport cities grew increasingly anti-British.